The music world moves fast. Want to stay up to date on the latest albums and get in-depth examinations with the artists? Check out Consequence of Sound, the podcast. Bite-sized album reviews for the music fan on the go who wants to stay in the know, and much more. Subscribe to the series on iTunes or your favorite podcast provider, and let the writers of Consequence of Sound steer you right. Check it out at consequenceofsound.net/COS podcast. Consequence Podcast Network.
Hey, welcome to another edition of Kyle Meredith With. It's an audio interview series presented by WFPK Independent Louisville at WFPK.org, Consequence of Sound, and the Consequence Podcast Network. Take a second before we get into the interview here just to hit the subscribe so you can keep up with all the interviews we put out every single week, every single month. And that's whether you're listening to the podcast version or you're checking us out on YouTube or listening on Spotify. I'm Kyle Meredith. Today my guest, Wild Nothing's Jack Tatum. We're going to talk about the new record, Indigo, how it could have been a reaction to their previous record. We'll also get into my favorite song on the album, Canyon on Fire, this record being called a pop manifesto. Of course, there's some talk about the 80s and how it all ties into the album as well. It's Kyle Meredith with Wild Nothing.
Hello.
Is it fair to say, or rather ask, is this a reaction to the last record? That happens with a lot of artists. Every album seems to be a reaction, but there's something about this one that seems maybe specifically for that.
Kind of. I mean, it's probably more like what you're saying, where I think it's one of those things where there's a natural reaction to the last thing that I did. It's all this sort of push and pull, I think, for me, and I think with the last record, I was definitely trying to kind of like push my songwriting in different directions and kind of seeing the ways in which I could stretch myself and stretch my own creativity. And so in a certain way, I think with this record, it's kind of an attempt to rein things in a little bit and get back to the sort of core ideology of what this band is. And so in that sense, I think I was not only just reacting to the last record, but also kind of being a bit more reflective in terms of my past records as well, and kind of trying to keep the whole lineage of everything in mind as I was making the record.
There's some great songs all through it. I think the one that caught my ear off the bats, Canyon on Fire. It's sort of got a different mood than the rest of the record, is how I hear it. It's almost more of the guitars are up front on this one, and it's got that Cure style keyboard line going behind that. What's the story on this song? Because it does kind of set itself apart a little bit from the others.
Yeah, it does. That song in particular and Letting Go actually are the first songs that I wrote for this record. And so when I wrote them, I had no real kind of concept about what I was going to do next. I wasn't even necessarily even thinking about the next record yet, so much as just trying to kind of write songs. And so those songs, I wrote them both actually kind of immediately following the last record coming out. So basically, I had just put out Laugh at Pause and was kind of just in this in-between period where we hadn't really started touring yet, and I was just at home, so I was working on music. And so both of those songs were kind of, in a way, they were just me sort of trying to do what I was talking about, and just kind of like, it had been a while since I had just kind of like let songs flow easily, like there was a lot of effort made on the last record to just kind of like go against my initial instincts, just kind of as an experiment. And so I think with Canyon on Fire and Letting Go, I was kind of like, oh no, let me just kind of write what I think is like a quintessential Wild Nothing song or something. And so that was kind of what I was doing. And the record ended up taking a few turns in either direction from that moment, but that kind of like set the tone a little bit, I think. But yeah, I mean that song is definitely, it stands out a little bit. It's the most aggressive sounding song, I think, in terms of the guitar tones, and it's a memorable one for me as well.
I saw one interviewer had called this record your pop manifesto. I didn't know if that was projecting onto you or if you sort of agreed with that.
I do agree with that. Yeah, I definitely think of this record as a pop record first and foremost.
I mean, it says a lot about the music, but does that also feature into, how you're doing the lyrics, the type of songs that you're tackling thematically?
A little bit. I mean, I think once you've sort of set the scene for yourself, or at least what I was doing with this record was just kind of like, at a certain point saying like, okay, I'm thinking of this as a pop record. I'm referencing a lot of like pop records from the 80s, and more so than I was before. I think before I was much more interested in kind of understatement and referencing a lot of bands that now, I think have a lot of cult status and big followings, but at the time weren't necessarily like intentionally pop artists. But I think with this record, I was looking at people more like Tears for Fears or something, for instance, who were like, I think that was always their intention and always the undercurrent of their music was like, they kind of wanted to write hits. But yeah, so I mean, there's a little bit of that, like I don't think necessarily that I was shooting that high, but in terms of like the structure of the songs and the lyrical content a bit too, I think there was an attempt to kind of find a way to write about the things that I wanted to write about, but also like still be relatable.
Looking back at that, you mentioned the 80s. It's hard not to do a Wild Nothing interview without bringing up that term, that phrase there. But there was, you look back at that decade and there was this real interest in the future at that point. And they were trying to make, there was a lot of artists that were trying to, to consider what the future would be like. And now here we are in that future. Usually this was around the era that, a lot of folks would hit on. And I look at a song like The Closest Thing to Living and hearing you talk about, the title track, talk about the color indigo and that glued to the screens and the blue screens. And it's like, was this, I don't know if this is exactly what they had in mind, but sometimes I do, like, not to be hyperbolic with saying dystopian future, but it almost feels like a lot of that stuff did come true in that way.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think you had a lot of people in that era too that were kind of embracing really, really cold sounding productions, which I think is like what maybe turns a lot of people off about like that era of music. It's not particularly warm music, I mean, I think maybe it is like composition wise or like melody wise or whatever, but the production of a lot of those records are pretty kind of like clinical sounding, which I think was part of what you're talking about exactly, of this like embrace and push of like new and emerging technologies at the time, which is funny because, it's like, I don't know. I mean, that's always the curse, I think, of like being someone that pulls so much influence from other decades, is that really I'm looking at people that were in the moment being very kind of like forward thinking, but now here I am being like, looking backwards. But I don't know. It's just, I don't really know how else to describe it except that like, for some reason I don't relate to like 2018 progressive music or whatever that might mean. Like I don't, for some reason I'm less excited about like people that are doing something different just to be different, as opposed to people that are just writing songs well and like working with melody well. And that's like a timeless thing that doesn't, you can dress that up however you like. And for me, I dress it up in 80s clothes, I guess, but it's, that's just kind of like one facet of it.
Well, you give it a soul, though. I mean, recording it, live in the way you guys did, what parts of it you did record live. I mean, that's important. It can be looking back or looking forward, whatever, but there is a heart on this record, and I think that's, one of the things that really does make it stand out in that way. It's one thing I appreciate anyway.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I mean, and I'm glad that comes across for certain people, because we definitely went into like a lot of effort in order to accomplish that.
Well, it's definitely there. I'm a big fan. Jack, thank you so much for talking to me about it. Congratulations again on Indigo, and I hope we can see you around these parts at some point.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Yeah, I hope so too.
All right. Take care, sir.
All right. Take care. Bye.
And a big thanks to Jack Tatum of Wild Nothing. The new record is called Indigo, and it is now available. Hey, if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button. You enjoyed this interview, you might as well enjoy all the interviews that we put out every single week. And that means that if you're checking out the podcast, wherever you get your podcast from, or if you're listening on Spotify, or if you've got us plugged in on YouTube right now, go ahead and subscribe there. After that, head over to WFPK.org. That's where I do a show every Monday through Thursday from noon to 3 Eastern, and where you'll also find some bonus episodes of this series. I'm Kyle Meredith. I'll see you next time.
Consequence Podcast Network.